Russia's push for Lyman is growing more intense by the week, with Russia now launching dozens of assaults against a city that it once occupied. Ukraine, as always, is defending well and ensuring that any progress that Russia makes is slow and paid for in the blood of its soldiers. Still, Russia pushes. And Ukraine, knowing that it has an opportunity to do more damage than ever, has turned the Lyman front line into a deadly trap. Taking advantage of Russia losing its valuable forest cover, a clever strategy that forces Russian troops into the open, and the work of volunteers from a country that you might not expect, Ukraine has transformed the Lyman front line into a kill zone. That's devastating news for Russia. It really wants to recapture Lyman. The city, which is in Donetsk, was among the first that Vladimir Putin's forces were able to take following Russia's initial flash invasion of Ukraine. The city fell within the first few months of the war, though Lyman would soon become the site of one of Ukraine's greatest early victories against Russia. Putin's forces weren't able to celebrate for long as Ukraine launched a devastating counterattack and reclaimed Lyman in October 2022. At least Ukraine reclaimed what was left of the ravaged city. Lyman today is a far cry from the Lyman that existed before Putin launched his invasion. When Russia withdrew, its forces left behind equipment, personal belongings, and the gutted ruins of buildings that had been destroyed through shelling. The tarmac on the roads leading in and out of Lyman is pockmarked with holes and covered with shrapnel as the fighting for the city rages. Still, Ukraine isn't focused on Lyman's condition. Its goal is to ensure that the city doesn't fall back into Russia's hands, which in turn ensures that Lyman can't be used as a launching pad for future assaults on other Donetsk cities such as Slovyansk. Russia wants to gain that launching pad, though Critical Threat says that Lyman is a secondary objective. Russia still launches assaults, often large numbers of them, but the Russian attempts at advance are only tactical and will not be quick, will not degrade the combat effectiveness of the Ukrainian military writ large, and will not collapse the front lines, the outlet claims. Perhaps that lack of true dedication to taking the city is what led Ukraine to formulate a plan. If Russia isn't going to push with everything it has, Ukraine gets time to plan and execute bold strategies that devastate the Russian forces that are attempting to enter Lyman. One of those bold strategies was carried out toward the end of November, and Ukraine achieved precisely what it wanted to achieve. In a December 1st article, Euromaidan Press provides a rundown of the many traps that Ukraine has set that turned the Lyman front line into a kill zone, from which Russia's soldiers can't escape. The outlet states that the wooded area near the city has been a grey zone for much of the year, with Russia utilizing the leafy surroundings to conceal its troops and maneuver them around the outskirts of Lyman. For context, a grey zone in the Ukraine war refers to any area that is not fully controlled by either side. Both Russia and Ukraine are operating in the Lyman forests, each with different goals. Russia wants to advance, Ukraine wants to stop them. As we speak, Ukraine is conducting a sweep of the forested area that surrounds Lyman, eradicating pockets of Russian soldiers as it finds them. However, this is no ordinary sweep, Euromaidan Press reports. Ukraine has a far greater goal in mind when it comes to clearing the Lyman forest belt, noting that everything that is now being seen on the Lyman front line is part of a Ukrainian effort to retake and fortify the approaches into Lyman, thus preventing Russia's forces from regrouping and organizing a full push forward. Ukraine is trying to stay 2 steps ahead of the Russian occupiers, and it's working alongside a contingent of US mercenaries to get the job done. These soldiers of fortune are not officially part of the US military, though it's likely that many have served before. And as you'll find out a little later in the video, the American soldiers operating in Ukraine are far more numerous than you might think, and often play crucial roles in helping Ukraine achieve its objectives. Let's return to the Lyman front. Though it's been launching assaults in large numbers against Ukraine, Russia hasn't been loading those assaults with masses of soldiers and equipment. Instead, Russia has been taking advantage of the forests around Lyman to conduct slow and careful advances toward the city. The natural cover provided by the trees, and particularly the leaves on those trees, hides the advancing Russians from view, making it harder for Ukraine's reconnaissance drones to spot them from above. It's not impossible for Ukraine to locate the advancing Russians, but to do so, it has to deploy soldiers and first-person view or FPV drones in hunting operations. This has worked out well for Russia in recent months on the Lyman front. Operating in small groups, Russia's forces are following an infiltration strategy designed to pressure and stretch the Ukrainian front lines. Deploying infiltrators is a strategy that Russia has used extensively in 2025. Business Insider explained more in a November 25th article, in which it pointed out that Russia is deploying ever smaller groups of soldiers to sneak behind the Ukrainian lines. Often, those soldiers take advantage of inclement weather, such as rain and fog, which makes it hard for Ukraine's drones to spot them. In the forests of Lyman, the trees offer even more cover. Ukraine has described this new Russian approach as increasingly problematic, Business Insider adds. It quotes Lieutenant Colonel Yuri Mironenko, who is a former drone unit commander and the current Ukrainian Deputy Minister of Defense for Innovation, who says, "Infiltration by small groups, sometimes just one person with a rifle and grenades, whose task is to hide in a basement or dugout, is difficult to counter. The problem is clear. It's not that Russia's infiltrators are actually capable of taking territory. The groups are far too small and the infiltrators can be destroyed as soon as they're discovered. But they do offer advantages to Russia. An infiltrating soldier can create footage and even shoot photographs of the Russian flag in areas of Ukraine that Russia is nowhere near close to claiming. This has become a common tactic for Putin and his propagandists. In Vovchansk, for instance, Russian forces have raised a flag to act as though they occupy the city, only for Ukraine to destroy them. But by the time the Russian soldiers are dead, Putin has what he wants from them, a propaganda victory that he can tout, even if the situation on the ground is very different. The infiltration tactics can have a more practical purpose too. The few soldiers in each of these units may briefly seize key positions. This forces Ukraine to divert troops to deal with them, which stretches the front lines. And if the infiltrators aren't dealt with, they can be joined by reinforcements, all as they disrupt Ukraine's operations using drones and mine warfare. This is no small problem for Ukraine. And in Lyman, the presence of so many trees has allowed these infiltrators to carry out their work to good effect. That brings us back to why Ukraine is clearing the Lyman forest belt. It's not just about stopping the infiltrators in their tracks, though that is a large part of it. As Euromaidan Press reports, clearing the Lyman forest belt pushes Russia's forces back toward Yampil. Russia claimed to have captured this small settlement on November 21st, and it appears it may have been telling the truth this time. However, what Russia didn't realize is that taking Yampil would not be as advantageous as it thought. To Russia, Yampil is yet another springboard that it can use to launch assaults on Lyman. But for Ukraine, Yampil is a wide-open territory with no trees and limited obstructions. Yampil can be turned into a kill zone by Ukraine. All that it has to do is shepherd the Russian forces attempting to use the Lyman forests for infiltration back to the occupied settlement from which they came, and the trap can be sprung. Ukraine's drones descend, snipers can rain fire down, the Russian troops in their captured settlement become vulnerable in ways they never expected. Euromaidan Press says that shifting the Russian forces back toward Yampil provides the visibility needed to allow the country's drone operators to monitor and respond to any movements those cornered Russian soldiers make. Artillery can also be trained on the entries and exits for the settlement, making it even harder for Russia's troops to advance. Russia thought it captured an important piece of territory in Yampil, but what it's really done is create a cauldron into which its soldiers can be forced, making them less effective when it comes to infiltrating Lyman. Still, Ukraine has to push the Russian soldiers into that settlement. On the tactical side, completing this push is relatively simple. Ukraine is responding to Russia's use of smaller units by deploying small units of its own. These assault groups are made up of reconnaissance teams, special forces operatives, and some of the American volunteers we mentioned earlier. Together, these soldiers sweep, relying on drone operators to carve out safe pathways through the Lyman forest. Those same operators also identify Russia's trenches, dugouts, and ambush positions, allowing Ukraine to spring surprise assaults that either kill the Russian infiltrators or force them back to Yampil. Either way, Ukraine wins. However, you may have identified a potential problem with this strategy based on something we mentioned earlier in the video. Russia's infiltrators have been taking advantage of the cover provided by the Lyman forest for months. How, then, can Ukraine's drone operators provide the reconnaissance needed to guide the small assault units safely through these forests? If Ukraine is unsighted, that must mean that Russia has the advantage on the Lyman outskirts. Not anymore. Winter has arrived in Lyman. And with winter comes the inevitable falling of the leaves from the many trees that surround Lyman. Suddenly, the foliage that for so long provided cover to Russia's infiltrators, in addition to weakening Ukraine's FPV drone signals to the point where they couldn't travel as far as they usually could, is now on the ground. Euromaidan Press highlights Russia's new issue, which also shows why Putin is so determined for his troops to capture as much territory as they could during Russia's massive and failed summer offensive. Ukraine, however, is gaining new advantages as winter approaches, as the falling foliage strips the forests of cover, leaving Russian troops far more exposed, the outlet says. Reconnaissance drones now spot movements earlier, providing commanders with clearer information and smoother coordination with assault teams. Ukraine can see into the forests around Lyman once more. For Russia, that means the winter conditions that have so often benefited its forces during past conflicts are now making it almost impossible for its infiltrators to get anywhere without Ukraine tracking and eliminating them. Winter, in general, has proven problematic for Putin's forces during every year of the war. Even as Putin orders massive airstrikes designed to deprive Ukraine of its gas and electricity during the coldest months of the year, Russia's ground forces deal with a litany of issues. The visibility in the Lyman forests is just one of them. As USA Today reported all the way back in 2022, Russia has many issues maintaining its supply lines, even when the weather in Ukraine is favorable. When winter descends, those lines become more vulnerable, again due to the increased visibility in places like the Lyman forests. Strikes against Russia's supply arteries inevitably follow, making it harder for Putin to keep already undersupplied and underfed soldiers supplied with everything they need for their assaults. In Lyman, that means Russia's infiltrators have to abandon their positions, heading back to the open ground of Yampil, or freeze and starve as Ukraine hunts them down. Lyman just had to survive until the cold weather came. Now that it has, Ukraine is reversing everything that Russia achieved in the Lyman forests. Russia is helping Ukraine in Lyman. Not that it intends to, but as Euromaidan Press points out, the majority of Russian troops operating in the trees surrounding the city are far from the best that Russia has to offer. Most are merely conscripts, many of whom are poorly prepared and even more poorly trained. Those conscripts are up against Ukraine's special forces and drone operators, along with the US volunteers. Whatever numerical advantages Russia has in Lyman are being offset by this gulf in quality, which is a story as old as the Ukraine war itself. Russia's conscripts aren't supposed to be in Ukraine. Unlike the country's contract soldiers and mercenaries who sign up to fight, conscripts are often among the youngest of Russia's soldiers. Most are around the age of 18 and are completing their mandatory year of military service, which isn't supposed to include deployment to a country where they will inevitably die. But that's what's been happening to the conscripts, as a May 20th Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty report reveals. The outlet profiles a Russian soldier named Alexander, who found himself going from digging trenches along the border between Russia and Ukraine to fight in those very trenches. "It turns out that I was sent into a combat zone against the law without asking," Alexander tells the outlet. And he's far from the only one. In his desperate attempts to shore up Russian numbers in Ukraine, Putin has increasingly turned toward the young conscripts completing their mandatory military service. Some are simply forced into Ukraine, despite that being against the law. Others are pressured into signing contracts, often after just 4 months of the most basic military training. Also that Putin has warm bodies he can send into the Ukraine war meat grinder. Putin conscripted another 135,000 soldiers back in October, which followed a conscription round that brought in 160,000 soldiers between April 1st and July 15th. Russia's leader claims that these conscripts won't enter Ukraine. What Ukraine's assault groups have discovered near Lyman proves him wrong, according to Euromaidan Press. As the assault teams deal with Russian conscripts, the US volunteers we've mentioned several times are proving themselves vital to the Lyman defense too. Those volunteers are underreported, but are far more numerous than you might believe. A September report in the New York Times reveals that independent estimates suggest that anywhere between 1,000 and several thousand Americans have signed up to fight against Russia on Ukraine's behalf. These volunteers, many of whom are former soldiers themselves, have many motivations. Some come looking for purpose and possibilities they found lacking in dead-end jobs back home, the New York Times says. Outrage at Russian aggression remains high on the list of reasons, while some soldiers are looking for a way to leave behind troubled lives. Still others want second chances at military careers and to test themselves in combat. Ukraine won't care why these American fighters want to help them. It'll care about the results that these volunteers deliver. And in Lyman, the American fighters working alongside Ukraine's special forces have proven themselves invaluable. Euromaidan Press reports that a video shot in the Lyman woodlands reveals that one of the American volunteers is working with the Ukrainian assault team. That soldier's presence appears to have played an important part in 4 Russian soldiers choosing to surrender to Ukraine rather than continuing to fight. The American calmly negotiated with the soldiers in Ukrainian and basic Russian, eventually convincing them to surrender. Perhaps we see the role that the US volunteers can play in Ukraine. Beyond bringing whatever fighting prowess they have to the table, these US fighters may offer Ukraine an effective means through which to communicate with Russia's soldiers. A Ukrainian attempting to negotiate surrender may use threats or even give up and kill the Russians, perhaps justifiably considering the ravages experienced by his country due to Putin's invasion. Essentially acting as a mediator, a US volunteer can maintain their calm and get the result that Ukraine wants. After all, Ukraine capturing prisoners of war could be considered even more humiliating for Putin than Russian soldiers dying, especially as Russia's military tends to prefer its soldiers to die fighting rather than surrendering to the enemy. Then there are Ukraine's snipers. We mentioned them earlier in the video, and they've become much more effective now that winter has arrived in Lyman. Commenting on footage released from the Lyman combat lines, Euromaidan Press says, "A separate moment in the footage shows a precise sniper shot that demonstrates how the improved winter sight lines can allow Ukrainian marksmen to engage targets at longer distances. Combine those clear lines of sight with live aerial surveillance made possible by the trees around Lyman no longer carrying leaves, and you get another threat posed to the increasingly trapped Russians. The Lyman front line has now become a deadly trap. Russia's forces no longer have options. The infiltrators that took advantage of tree cover in the summer and inclement weather during the fall are now increasingly exposed. Ukraine's reconnaissance drones can see them, and assault teams are on the hunt for them. In the best-case scenario, these exposed Russian soldiers might get lucky enough to run into an American volunteer who is willing to negotiate their surrender. But if that doesn't happen, death likely awaits. That death might come as a result of one of Ukraine's drones, a sniper's bullet, or a forced retreat into Yampil, which is now monitored by drones and surrounded by Ukrainian artillery. Lyman isn't going to fall this winter. Ukraine's defensive line is holding strong, and its forest clearance operation is stabilizing what has been a grey zone in the Ukraine war for months. Russia is claiming that it is advancing, as it always does. On December 1st, the Kyiv Post reported that Russia claimed to have taken the villages of Novoselivka and Stavki, both of which are near Lyman, but Ukraine has denied these claims, calling them false propaganda and another information manipulation. Right now, that's all that Putin has left in Lyman. Lies about Russia's success, as his soldiers get caught in traps that have all sprung now that winter has arrived. Putin certainly isn't doing his Lyman forces any favors. In addition to Ukraine's forest clearance strategy, those soldiers have to deal with their country sending them into the fight with no helmets, body armor, or other basic equipment. Russia's troops are now fighting naked in Lyman because Russia has no armor left. But it goes even deeper than that, as you'll discover if you watch our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest events on the Donetsk front. And thank you for watching.